Good morning, everyone. It's good to be here batting cleanup. You are the ones who chose to stick around and not fly out, and I'm thankful for that because I think we've got some hopefully some stuff to say today that will be a blessing to you. I've been tasked by H and some of the others to tell my story today. I am a relatively recent convert to Anglicanism, and we felt that it would be helpful for you all to hear the story of a rookie coming into the big leagues, as it were. But before I do that, I want to read one passage of Scripture that's been really kicking around in my heart this week. I have had time this week to engage some quiet reading, some Lectio Divina. We were discussing this in our little breakout session on Thursday, and the Lord has really been speaking to me, and I think a lot of what He's been speaking to me has some bearing and impact on what we're seeing this weekend in terms of our leadership here in the mission. I want to read a few verses and then just share this for a couple of minutes. This is for free, and the other one is the big hitter, my actual task talk. The 18th chapter of Matthew, the Bible says, at that time, the disciples came to Jesus and asked, "Who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" And He called a child whom He put in front of them and said, "Truly I tell you, unless you change and become like children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven." Unless you change and become like children, you'll never enter the kingdom of heaven. When I think about what we've heard and seen from our leadership, from Philip in his talk on the first morning there is a sense of godly childlikeness. And I've wondered about that text. The Lord spoke to me early in the week and said, "Kris, I want you to make it your goal, your life's goal actually in this season, to change and become like a child." And I began to think, what is Jesus getting at? Is He saying we ought to be cute and cuddly and innocent and smell good and obey our mommy? Was that what Jesus was getting at? I don't think so. See, Jesus taking the disciple who had been arguing about who is the greatest and bringing a child in front of them, that dialogue was all about power. That dialogue was all about a bunch of guys who were acting like insecure adolescents who were grabbing power and saying, "Who's the best? I'm the best. You're the best. Well, let's go to Jesus and ask Him who the best is." And Jesus said, "I will bring a child in front of you who is not concerned with power. And I'll say you have to actually change and become like this child." I believe that the days in front of us as believers in an increasingly post-Christian society, our effectiveness will be marked by our reticence to grab for power and our willingness to be content with who we are in front of a God who loves us just like we are. But that's hard work. And I just want to say of Philip, I'm honored to follow you. I'm honored to be in the Anglican mission with you as a relatively new church in this movement. We joined about 4.5, 5 years ago. And so it's been a tumultuous few years. And yet I'm so thankful for what the Lord is doing. And I'm hopeful that we will all be a people who, going forward in our individual walk with God, in our daily life, and in our ministry life, if we're in pastoral leadership, that we will be people who endeavor to change and become like children, that we would be people who are increasingly unconcerned with power. Because when we do that, I think we become very attractive to a watching world. So I want to tell you my story. This is a story that goes back to beginnings for me, and I will promise not to spend too much time in the beginnings and get to the Anglican bit soon, because the title of this chat is Why I'm an Anglican. My name is Kris, as H said, but it's Kris with a K, K-R-I-S. I was named after Kris Kristofferson. No joke. My parents were raging hippies. I grew up in a home where we had a lot of love and a lot of drugs in our home growing up. My mom and dad are still married, but they were hippies in the hippie generation. And so we were in a very, very non-traditional home setting. My dad was a drug dealer, and he held down a great job and loved me deeply and dearly. And so I grew up thinking that every family in America, had folks that were smoking pot and having people come in and out of the house because it just seemed normal to me. My mom and dad are believers and members at the church where I serve as pastor in the city center of Atlanta, and so they both are following the Lord. But even before they were following the Lord, they loved one another passionately, and they loved me well. And I grew up in a home that really was a house full of love, but a house with really very little structure in the way of traditional structures. Well, my mother became a believer when I was a young child and started taking me to church. And so I spent my formative years with a foot in two different worlds. Mom bringing me to primarily non-denominational charismatic churches, and my dad being a really good guy who so valued integrity, ironically, that he would not go to church if he knew that he wasn't living right with the Lord. And so my dad didn't want to be a hypocrite. And I can look back and really applaud him for that. He said, I'm not ready. I remember when I was a teenager, one day he got up and he said to my mother, he said, I'm coming to church with you. And he went to church and he walked to the front. He gave his life to the Lord and never touched alcohol or drug after that day. It was a supernatural deliverance. And so as a very young child, at about 12 years old, I saw God do something that only God could do. I saw a supernatural intervention. And so I became, at that moment, convinced of the power of God. Because I had lived in a house where I saw addiction. And I thought, there's no way out of this. And then all of a sudden, my father was clean, serving the Lord. And now that love and that integrity was aimed toward the Lord and toward our family in a totally new way. So I had a model of the power of God coming into my life, but we were still super non-traditional. As a young person, I became a leader in various settings. In our youth group, at school, I launched a Bible study that grew from about 4 kids to about 50 kids. And so God's hand was on me from an early age, and yet I had no traditional sort of framework for that. I just knew that I loved the Lord, and I knew that I was reading the Bible, and I wanted to please God. Well, lo and behold, as a young adult, my wife and I, Karen, we found ourselves in pastoral ministry at a small church in Atlanta, Georgia. And this church was a charismatic church in a movement that I deeply love and respect, but it was a sort of fringe church in that movement, a church that focused really, really heavily on experience, on ecstatic experience, on passion and drive for God, and yet at times elevated gifting over character. We've probably all been in or heard of churches that function in a manner that is similar to that. And what happened to me as a very young Christian, a young man trying to figure out how to be a husband to a wife that loved me but was wondering if I was going to grow up and be that kind of man for her, I burned bright and burned out. And it's a sad feeling to be in your early 20s and think, good Lord, I'm a mess. See, I was told in sectors of the Christian church, the charismatic church, that the big one, the big move of God, the big wave of God was always just around the corner. I would always hear things like, the waters are knee deep now, but they're going to be waist deep and then over our head any minute. And you combine some of that push, the frantic push, with poor leadership over me, a sense of us feeling neglected, and even at times maybe in an abusive relationship with a pastor who had brokenness and pain of his own, it left me within an inch of letting go of everything. I remember thinking one evening as a youth pastor, and that's what I was in this little church, I thought, if pastors are inevitably going to hurt people and wear people out and burn people out, then I don't think I can be one of those. And y'all, that was really hard for me because by this time I felt almost convinced that this was what I was supposed to be. And so I entered this desert place, this place where I thought, I feel that the thing that I am is going to inevitably lead me to brokenness and pain and even wounding people that I love, my family and people around me, because the only construct I had was this one vision of the world and the church, and it sent me into a tailspin. You know, Hebrews says, everything that can be shaken will be shaken, and after that, only that which is unshakable will remain. Well, that which was left and unshakable was a precious small number of things in my life. I felt almost like I was losing my faith. And it's a terrible feeling to get up in front of people and open the Bible and teach and preach and think you are losing your faith. And that's exactly where I was. We were in Toronto at a conference at the Toronto Blessing, the Toronto Renewal, and we were in a room with 5,000 people, and we sat behind these English people at the Toronto meetings. And some of you probably were around back in the day and went up to Toronto to those meetings. They were gigantic meetings full of people from all over the world. And one night, during the little meet and greet, we turned and shook hands with these English people. Just ran into them, became fast friends. One of those guys was a pastor at a non-denominational church in rural England in Dorset County. And this was not a Church of England church. It was a non-denom church, much like the one that I had lived in. And he became my friend, and over time he started to send these hints to my wife and myself. He said, why don't y'all think about coming over to England and being youth pastors at our little country church? And I said, no. Why would I move to England? We lived in the city center. We did not want to move to rural England. It seemed like a world away. It seemed so far away that we just said no, no, no. And he asked persistently over 6 months. And things became so bad in Atlanta that the idea of going to England started to look better and better and better. So we literally felt like the Lord had opened a window, and we jumped through that window and we went to Great Britain. When I arrived in Great Britain, we were tasked to lead a youth group of 6 kids in a town of 10,000 people. My wife and I moved from city center Atlanta to a town of 10,000 people. I will never forget turning the television on in England. 4 channels. Because we lived in Hickville, England, where you couldn't even get Channel 5. And I called up my friend, Gareth, and I said, something's wrong with my television. He said, oh no, son, nothing's wrong with your television. Then we get out of our car, our little flat, and we walk down to the high street, and it's 6 o'clock on a Monday, and every single shop in the whole town is closed. And it was at that point that it started raining. And I'm not exaggerating, it rained for 41 days in a row. And we lived in this little town where the streets were gray, the fields were gray, the buildings were gray, the sky was gray. And if I could have found a building tall enough to jump off of and end it, I would have, but I couldn't. We were stuck in redneck England. And if you've been to England and only spent time in places like Oxford and London and Cambridge, you don't know about this. There are small country places where if you're from a place like me and you sound like I sound, you walk in and everybody thinks John Wayne's come into the building. We were outsiders. And we were heartbroken outsiders. And so they said, go love on these kids. So I said, okay. And then my wife gets pregnant. I'm thinking, Lord Jesus, we are so broken right now. And now we're going to have a baby. And I remember telling the Lord, I said, I am not going to read the Bible anymore until something changes. And I felt like I was about to lose my faith. And so I literally did what we taught our kids to do when they were little. I've taught my kids, if you get lost in the Walmart, don't try to fix it. Just sit down, just stop. And that's what I did with God. I was in a devastated place and I said, I'm not going to try to fix it. I'm not going to run away. I'm just going to sit down. And so I remember it as clear as day. I said to the Lord one night, I said, you're going to have to figure out how to lead this youth group because I'm not going to read the Bible and pray because I can't do it anymore. I said, I'm tired of pushing for ecstatic experience. I'm tired of pulling a rabbit out of the hat. I can't do it anymore. It was demoralizing. And then a revival starts among the youth. It was the most confusing time of my life. The youth group went from 6 kids to 70 kids in like 3 months. They're all getting saved. I didn't realize this about England, but you have access to public schools in England. And they're used to having vicars who are 75 years old get up and speak some unintelligible message. Well, they asked the young American guy to go in, and I think I could have actually just opened the phone book and they would have listened to me because I sounded funny to them. Well, kids started coming to church and kids started meeting the Lord, and we're in the middle of some sort of like rural revival, and I'm not reading the Bible or praying. It was a confusing time. We had these friends in the church, Jess and Chris Pittman. And Jess at the time was a mother of 5 and a lay person in the church, and they were in this little non-denom charismatic church, and they told me one night they were our favorite people because we were pregnant, they had kids, and they invited us into their home. They extended true hospitality, and they said, come and just live life with us, and we just fell in love with these people, and still to this day, they matter so much to me. Jess said, Chris, I don't want to freak you out, but we're going home to the Church of England. And I thought, what is the Church of England? What? Why would you go home to the Church of England? She said, we feel like the Lord is calling us to come home. And she noticed something that no one else noticed. She said, Kris, you don't seem that everything outside is going really well, but I don't think you're doing so well. I said, I'm not. And she handed me a book of common prayer with an English hymnal. It sits on the top of a small bookshelf in my study. And I look at this prayer book. It's a symbol of God's life raft to me. It's a mark of things turning around in my life. And I had no idea what it was. And she said, this will help you if you want it to allow the Bible to come to you rather than you having to work up inspiration to come to the Bible and figure it all out on your own. She said, you don't seem like you have the energy to be innovative. That marked the beginning for me of my heart thawing and coming back to the Lord. I stand before you as an Anglican today, not because I was recruited into this, not because I thought it was the cool, ancient, future thing to do. I stand here as an Anglican today because I'm convinced that if the Lord had not thrown me that life draft, I might not be following him today. And so a broken man from a hippie family in a non-traditional church setting who thinks he's losing his faith was handed a prayer book, and I hid it like contraband. Because I was going to a church where if they saw me reading from a prayer book and engaging the daily lectionary, they would have thought I had lost my mind and stopped trusting in the Holy Spirit. They would have said, oh Lord, he's quickly on his way to becoming the frozen chosen. So I started reading the daily lectionary without telling anyone. After a little while, I told my wife, Karen. I'll never forget my first Church of England experience. This same family lived in a village called Pencilwood. Only in England can you live in a place called Pencilwood. It was the most wonderful place, Pencilwood. And so there was a little tiny village church that was about 550 years old, as they are. And it was so small that you'd only fit about 40 people in this little church. And my friend Chris was a bell ringer in the church. And he said, come along and we'll ring the bells. And I said, oh, awesome. I'd love to see the bells ring. So we go into the service after Chris rings the bells and calls the people to worship. And there are about 20 people in there, no one under 70 but us. And I'm standing at the back and something starts to happen to me. They're just doing what they do. It's not especially lively. And yet I feel warm, wet things on my face. And I'm crying. And I'm so disconnected from my emotions, I don't know why I'm crying. As I look back, I can see that I was, for the first time in my life, watching what a group of people look like who are being faithful, who are older, and have been at this a lot longer than us. See, we Americans tend to think that the Lord wasn't up to much before the Declaration of Independence or before the third wave charismatic renewals or whatever it is. And yet here it was, I was getting a glimpse into something really old, and I was seeing faithfulness manifest itself right in front of me. So it convinced me even further to begin this reclamation, this renewal process. So I started reading the Bible again. And the Lord, I think in his mercy, began to meet me and do things to thaw my heart. And I was coming back. I was coming back to the Lord. So we moved back to England because we had that baby. To America because we had that baby. Grandparents become very compelling when you are having your first child. And so they asked me to stay. And I said, no, we need to go home. And so we went home and we had nothing. But we were healthy. We were alive. I got back involved at a vineyard church, and my gifts made room for me again, and we found home in the vineyard church, and it was wonderful. That church was a church planting church, and so I said to my pastor, I said, I think we're going to plant a church in the city center of Atlanta. And he said, awesome, let's do it. So we planted Trinity, as H said, in October of 2002. And during that time when we planted the church in the city center, we hit a vacuum in the city. And so there weren't many churches in the city center. We hit this vacuum and the church grew rapidly. It grew so rapidly that everyone was really excited. And I was terrified because I knew that I was young. We planted in my mid-20s. And I knew that I was just recovering from a devastating time and I didn't want to mess it up. So I went to our team when we planted the church and I said, I would like us to receive communion every single Sunday. And in the vineyard, that's rare. You lot do that, probably almost all of you. But in the Vineyard, it's unheard of. I had never heard of another Vineyard church, or frankly, another evangelical church that received communion every Sunday. And yet it was one of the first takeaways from my time in England where I saw something really beautiful there. So we received communion every Sunday. Now, we didn't know what we were doing. We were just playing around with it, I think, at the time because we were so young. And the church started to grow and grow and grow and grow. We went from one service to 2 services to 3 services to 4 services to 5 services, all on Sunday. Custer, I have a little sense of what old Custer must have felt at his last stand. We were outnumbered. People were coming into our church community who were unchurched, de-churched, and under-churched. We were dealing with a bunch of people who had never cracked the Bible. They had heard maybe a few Bible stories, and we were overwhelmed. And I remember as the church was growing, having this fork in the road moment where I thought, we can go one of 2 directions here. We can either just let it be what it is and run the risk of hollowing out, of looking great on the outside and yet lacking depth and substance, of just playing to the least common denominator, or we can make a commitment relative to substance and depth. We also thought that substance and depth in a city might slow down church growth. See, the problem with being the flavor of the month is there's always another month coming, and then you're not the flavor of the month anymore. And we were aware that we were the flavor of the month and that likely we would not be the flavor of the month here soon. So we devised what we termed internally growth retardation strategies. We wanted to slow down growth and even stop it if we could. A lot of people have an ambition to grow a church. I would say that if you do, God have mercy on your soul because you might get what you want. For us, we wanted to be a people who were qualified to run well and finish well, and so we decided we wanted to slow down church growth. And there's no way to slow down church growth like stopping topical sermons and reading more of the Bible. And so I went to our team and said, and this was also an embarrassment. I went to our team and I said, guys, I'm 27 years old and I'm out of ideas. And that's a really bad feeling, especially when you live in a church culture that says, be innovative, be creative. And I realized that if I were the creative ceiling of our church, then our church was going to be in trouble. So I went to them and said, listen, I do this reading plan in the Book of Common Prayer. They have one for Sundays. And so I said to the guys, our leadership team, I said, they have these selections for Sundays. I want to pick the gospel selection and just teach from that. Is that cool? And they said, this is not a lie or an exaggeration. They said, yes, we'll try it, just don't tell anyone. So we started teaching the lectionary without telling a soul. We taught the lectionary at our church for almost 4 years before anyone knew that we were teaching the lectionary. I would hear the best things. People would come up to me and say, I was at my grandmother's Episcopal church this morning, and the priest taught the same text that you did. And I would just say, how about that? So slowly but surely, the focus came off of me. I wasn't pulling a rabbit out of the hat on Saturday night. It was the same thing in my church life, that I had found so much liberty in my private life with God. And all of a sudden, the Bible was coming to me rather than me treating the Bible like a Denny's buffet, picking and choosing what I want. And the church started to grow, not just numerically, but with regard to depth and biblical literacy, because as much as we claim that we're a full gospel people, we conveniently ignore certain parts of the Bible, don't we, when we have the choice. And I remember I would see things coming and think, oh, Lord. But I'd have to grow up and be a big boy and deal with the Bible as it came to me, even the hard parts of the Bible. And so we started teaching from the Bible. And I think for me, for the first time, we started to see the church grow in terms of biblical literacy. And then we ran into other problems in the life of our church. Now, I want to say to you, we were not endeavoring to become Anglicans at this point. I didn't think that was an option. I had never met an Anglican. You all were an exotic breed that I had never met. So we had no ambition to become Anglicans. We were just trying to do church as faithfully as we could, and we stumbled upon 2 treasures from the Anglican treasure chest without putting 2 and 2 together. And then I remember thinking, Easter sneaks up on us every single year. We want it to be awesome, but it's just not. Christmas sneaks up on us every single year. We want Christmas to be meaningful, but it just turns out to be sentimental. And I thought, wait, in that book, they tell us about seasons, about Lent and Advent. And so we started observing Lent and Advent in our church without even using those words. See, a lot of us in this group that grew up as cradle Episcopalians and now faithful Anglicans, we can take for granted some of the treasures that we've been given. Well, at my church, we don't take those things for granted because we're new converts. And so we wouldn't say the thing, we would just say the why behind the thing, and our people began to buy in. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people fasting and then learning to feast, treating Easter not just as a day, but a great 50 days. That Easter is greater in every respect than Lent. And our church began to buy into these things because they craved it. Our people were unchurched and they craved rhythm and sustainability, and they craved beauty, and they craved being a part of something that was deeper and bigger than what they had seen before. And so our people began to take another step down the Canterbury Trail. It was at this point that I thought, oh, maybe I should tell the church about the daily lectionary. So I did. I said, I've been reading the Bible this way for a long time. And they said, well, we would like a plan, because I found out, like Brian has told us so beautifully with regard to the Bible, that people live with the Bible as a should. I should read the Bible. I should floss my teeth. I should exercise. But we live in the realm of should, and we never actually do it because we don't have a plan. And one day I just said, y'all, I've been engaging a plan for a long time, and it's an old plan. I think it's like 600 years old or 500 years old. I didn't even know at the time. And our people started reading the daily lectionary in the hundreds. I would say right now at our church, recognizing that 90% of percentages are made up on the spot. So take it for what it's worth. More than half of our church read the daily office, read the daily lectionary. More than half. We have people in our church who've created free apps for Droid and iPhone that have had over 40,000 downloads. I mean, our people have really bought into this idea because they don't see it as this sort of traditional ought to. They see it as a tool to get them into the Bible, to become a people of the book. And so we started to grow. At this point, I thought, wait a minute, we're just being faker Anglicans. It was a weird moment for me. I realized we've utilized these treasures, and yet we're not in. It was like standing next to a stream but not being in the stream. So I did something. I'd never met one of you. So I emailed N.T. Wright. I found his email address. He was the Bishop of Durham at the time. I found his email address on some website, and I wrote him a letter. And I didn't expect to hear back from the fellow, but I did. It was like one of the highlights of my life at the time. I'm a huge N.T. Wright fan. I wrote him and said, I'm a vineyard pastor, and I feel like I'm an Anglican on the inside. What should I do? He wrote me back, and this is what he said. He said, well, you can't be an Episcopalian. And then, and you laugh at that, but then he said, and you might not want to be an Anglican because they're not the nicest group of people in the world. And since then, I understand a little bit of what he means. You have to be very careful about the cheap amen, right? Of sort of chuckling and laughing about those other people and realizing that we're broken. We're sinful people too, and in need of God's redemption, His kindness, His goodness. We have to change and become like little children. Well, N.T. Wright said, you just have to trust the Lord. And he wrote me a really thoughtful email for a guy who'd never met him and didn't expect to hear from him. So at that point, we felt like, okay, we're just supposed to wait and watch. Well, someone put me in touch with a fellow named Doc Loomis. And I was speaking to Doc on the telephone, and Doc was telling me he was my first real Anglican that I ever spoke to. And Doc, when I was speaking to him on the telephone, said, well, it happens that there is a meeting of the House of Bishops, the Council of Bishops from the Anglican Mission in Atlanta at the airport right now. And it was like one of those Acts moments. I thought, and he said, would you like me to send one of these Anglicans over? And I said, yes, I would like to meet an Anglican. They must have drawn straws at the airport, and T.J. Johnston got the short straw. And so they sent Bishop T.J. Johnston over to our church. And T.J. was the first Anglican man that I had embraced and looked in the face. And he sat in our office with my senior leadership team. And there was not a dry eye in the room. And I can look back at that time and I can say it was a holy moment. Everything seemed to come together in that moment. See, one of the things that I had longed for was pastoral care. I had a lot of pastors asking me, so what are you running these days? How big is the church? What new programs do you have going on? But I didn't have a lot of people asking me if I was loving Jesus and devoting my life to him. I didn't have a lot of people asking me if I was loving my wife and my children well. I didn't have a lot of people asking me if I was serving the staff that God had given me to the best of my ability to be faithful. And yet TJ asked me all of those questions. I had never experienced anything like it. And I sat there and wept. And I thought, if that's an Anglican, I want to be one of those. So we sense the Lord moving us forward. TJ became my bishop 2.5 years before I became an Anglican. This was not political strategy. This was not bureaucratic anything. And that's one of the things I love about the Anglican mission. TJ said to me after that meeting, if you want me to walk alongside you, I will walk alongside you whether you become an Anglican or not, because I see a young leader that I believe in. He became my pastor. Augustine said bishops are pastors to pastors. And that's what that man is. And that's what Philip Jones is becoming in my life. So 2.5 years later, because we're a deliberative church, at the time we were just under 1,000 on Sundays. Now we're close to 1,200 on Sundays. We began a process of transition, and we slowly transitioned our community. And after 2.5 years of preparation, we joined the Anglican mission. That's been about 5 years ago. And you know what? Nobody left our church. Not one. We had become Anglicans, and then we stuck a sign on the door. We had taken so many steps down the Canterbury Trail that we realized it would take more effort to move back to the center of whatever other movement we were in than to just take the final step into this. I want to share with you now just a few short things that are a part of the story that I just told you, but are treasures that our church has come to learn, to love, and to grow into. I'm not going to tell you anything new, but what I hope to do is to shine a light on some of what is best about our Anglican worship. I believe, it is my conviction, that Anglican spirituality is well suited to reach an increasingly post-Christian society. But we have to engage Anglican spirituality in a way where we are thoughtful and intentional and open to the move of the Spirit and to people coming in who don't look like us, don't think like us, and don't know the lingo and the jargon. At our church, here's some treasures. The rhythm in the life of the church is one of the best treasures at Trinity in that Anglican treasure chest. The seasons, the lectionary, the daily office. In a world of flux and chaos, this rhythm, this repetitive, beautiful rhythm invites people to belong to something bigger than them. And our church loves it, has jumped in with great vigor and passion. Connected to that idea of rhythm, Anglican worship can also promote sustainability in the life of leaders. It takes us as leaders out of the center, and it puts the cross of Christ, the table, at the center. The lectionary then takes the creative juices and says, here, you can just be a part of something bigger than you and stand to the side so that you're not one running the show all the time. And I can tell you, as a church planter, that life is so rigorous, it's so busy, it's so full. I lived in coffee shops for years as a pastor, meeting with people and praying with people. I didn't have time to be as creative as I wanted to be, and I didn't have to. Anglican worship also reminds us that we are a people of the book. We read lots and lots of the Bible at our church. We read all those lessons now. And we celebrate those things because our people need to hear from the Lord, and they need to hear from the Scripture, and not just some pithy saying from a pastor who's trying to be cute with people. So we're a people of the book. Cramner, love that guy. He's a rock star in my community. Anybody burn his hand off before he died a martyr's death because he wanted to be faithful and he wanted to show how serious he was about recanting his recantation is a big deal at our church. People love him. What I love about Cranmer is that when that English Bible, the great Bibles were coming out and the Reformation was sweeping England, Cranmer gave every parish priest in England 40 days to put one of those English-speaking Bibles in the church so that anyone could access it. At the heart of our Anglican spirituality, we're a people of the book. We can't forget that and let it devolve into something that is less than that. We are a people of the book. We are a people who want people to have the Bible in their hands, and not only in their hands, but in their hearts and in their minds. And that is the heartbeat, one of the heartbeats of Anglican spirituality, and it has gripped my church. And my church is made up of people in their 20s and 30s, people who are not Anglicans by birth. They've chosen to walk into this stream because it works, it roots them, it grounds them, it centers them in something bigger than themselves. Anglican worship is also powerful because we get to tell the gospel story over and over and over again. A Sunday doesn't go by where we don't stand at that table and say, Jesus died for you. You don't have to do this on your own. And for a bunch of people who are getting high and having sex and struggling with any manner of sinful thing that would make us blush if they just told us about it, they need to know that God knows them and loves them and that he extends grace and mercy to them. That when they come to the table repenting, they can come to the table knowing that the Lord has met them there. Jesus is the very center of our liturgy. We just have to remember that and lean into it with everything we have. Anglican worship is also a movement of prayer. When we come together, we pray. Our prayer is common not because it's normal, it's common because it convenes us. And our people love it. I tell you, the daily lectionary for our people in terms of prayer has been transformative. I'll never forget in our church when the crisis in Darfur was happening. People were reading, there was a specific reading during the crisis in Darfur in the Psalms, and it was one of those Psalms that my church, like, hipster progressives, get really uncomfortable with violent imagery in the Bible. They're like, well, it just makes me feel uncomfortable when I read about all the blood and the babies being washed in the blood in Psalms because it's just violent seeming. Well, our people were reading a psalm that they typically would cringe because they're young and they're trying to figure out how they reconcile their worldview. And they realized that Christians hiding in the bush in Darfur were reading the same psalm that they were reading in the relative comfort of the coffee shop. And the light started coming on across our church of that's the way they feel, and they're crying out to God for justice and leaving outcomes to him. And so our people began to identify with the fact that when I'm reading in private, I'm reading with 80 some odd million other people, and I belong to them. And so we've become a people of prayer because we realize that when we pray alone, we're never really alone. And that things that we don't get, other Christians are probably in a primal way crying out to God for justice. And we can join them and understand that we are truly a people of prayer that are linked all over the world. That's been revelatory for our folks because we join something bigger than us. And not only are we a people of the book, not only are we a people of prayer, but we join a movement that's bigger than us. And not only do we join a movement that's bigger than us, we join a historic movement. And I will tell you, for people who don't know the Lord, who don't follow God, who don't have a history in this, being a part of something bigger and deeper and older than themselves is very, very compelling. Chesterton said we ought give a vote to the cemetery. And I think he was really on to something because he was inviting us to belong to something and to listen to our forebears, mothers and fathers who've gone on before us. And Anglican worship provides that historic connection in a way that is absolutely magnificent. Context and vernacular. It's another Anglican treasure. At our church, we don't wear vestments. It's not because I think vestments are bad or weird. Primarily it's because I live in Atlanta, Georgia, and if a bunch of white men walk around in white robes, it doesn't go over very well in my city. Y'all, every time I see us line up for one of those processions, it's like, as an Atlanta person, the Klan, we have a long and complicated relationship with the Klan where I live. We have a lot of African-American folks and urban, indigenous, poor, inner city folks that come to our church. And so vestments are not a nod toward context and vernacular. That would be missing context at Trinity to wear white albs. So I just wear them when I'm with you people. Context and vernacular have allowed us at Trinity to take liturgy and shape it so that it makes sense to people, both who know and understand liturgy and those who don't. The goal, I think, in Anglican worship is to understand who your people are, who your mission field is, and begin to tailor that liturgy without dumbing it down, without washing it out, in such a way that people who know the rules and the lingo and the jargon get it, but people who don't stumble through all of their worship. And at Trinity, I think we've worked really hard to do that. Anglicanism also provides a sense of three-stream spirituality, at least it does in the Anglican mission, and I am so thankful for that. And at our church, and this may not be the case at your church, but at our church, here's the way it works. If you look at the liturgical, the charismatic, and the evangelical, or whatever it is that you use those words, spirit, sacrament, word, scripture, at Trinity, everybody in the church is really excited about one of those, sort of okay with a second, and totally sketched out by a third. So you got the Episcopalians who are totally good with this liturgical stream at our church, and yet when they see someone with their hands in the air kind of sway into the music, they think, oh Lord, it's one of those Pentecostals, and so they distance from them. Our Baptists at Trinity think, well, they read the Bible and they believe in conversion and people get saved, but all that structure, I'm not sure about that. When people come to Trinity, and I hope when they come into the Anglican mission, they're being invited to live in a kingdom tension where nobody gets it their way, where we're invited to appreciate differences and to lean into those differences. And at Trinity, we do it hardcore. We are more charismatic than we've ever been. We see regular physical healing. We see God move in powerful ways. We're also very missional, very evangelical. We have a very high view of Scripture and conversion. And we're also a people who want to lean into the historic roots of our faith. It's one of those gifts in the Anglican mission that we can't forget and we shouldn't minimize. We need to celebrate it. And finally, I would say that Anglicanism provides for pastoral care. At its best, it provides for pastoral care of its leaders. T.J. Johnston has been my pastor for years and years and years. And that wasn't primarily because he had a job to do. It's because I believe the Lord has tasked him to love on me and to care for me and to make sure a young leader didn't tank his ministry too early on. And I'm so thankful for you, TJ. I'm so thankful. I'm so thankful for Philip as I'm growing in relationship with him and we're all learning and experiencing the gift of his leadership in this next season. I think we can celebrate and we can move forward in mission. And lastly, I want to say this. As we move into the future, a professor in seminary once said to me, the church is always one generation away from extinction. As we move into the future as the Anglican mission, if we do not attract young leaders who are willing to lean into mission and innovation within the Anglican value system, if we don't attract them, then this thing will shrivel up and go away. Please make room for people like me. Make room for new Anglicans who have a passion for this. We may do it differently. We may look unlike you look in terms of our worship settings. We may do things that seem lower church than you would prefer, and yet make room for us. Because I can tell you that my journey into Anglicanism is not external, it was internal. It was not something that was politically motivated for me. I didn't want to do this because it was cool. I did this because the Lord threw me a life raft and He saved my life with God. I became an Anglican because I didn't know where else to turn, and God threw a life raft to me and then renewed me from the inside out. And I'm going to tell you, there are countless others like me that are out there. There are men and women who have a sense of calling and purpose and mission and vision, who are called to lead, and it is our job to spot them and to celebrate them and to train them and make sure they're Anglican enough if they're going to put that name on the door of their church or take holy orders, and yet let them run and lean into context and vernacular. If we do that, we will see flourishing in the next move in the Anglican mission. If we do that, we'll be the missionary society that God has called us to be. We'll lead and we'll love and we'll see people get saved and we'll see people appreciate the things that we appreciate and they'll look different. My hope and prayer is that when we convene here in 2 years, that we've got a slew of young leaders coming into this thing. I'm 38 years old. I'm increasingly seeing my job is not to be the young guy, but to turn and empower young leaders after me. At Trinity, we're releasing a church plant on Easter Sunday. We're sending out 40 people out of our church into a church plant that's going to be 3 miles down the road. And the pastor of that church plant is in his 20s. He's reaching people that I can't reach. In September, we're going to be sending out what we're calling a parish plant on the east side of our city. And the leader of that parish plant, who's going to be a part of our staff and yet the primary teaching voice, is a 29-year-old female who is remarkably gifted and talented named Ashley Matthews. And we suspect 200 people are going to go with that plant. God is moving, y'all. Aslan is on the move. And we just have to keep up with him. And this isn't about our plans and our procedures. This is about us seeing the Lord move in a way that advances the kingdom of God. And I believe the Anglican mission will be better off for it. So when you find young leaders who maybe slightly annoy you, celebrate them. You know what? Immaturity is not a sin. You have to go through immaturity to become mature. Immaturity just is a result of a lack of experience and exposure. Let's celebrate and see people mature. And I believe the future will be secure for us as a mission. Thanks for having me. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you.